She was meant to die nameless in the snow until the Alpha King found her and felt the impossible awaken. One frozen heartbeat bound his iron crown to an omega his own laws condemned. Would saving her destroy everything he ruled? Welcome to a realm where the moon governs destiny, where ancient magic awakens forbidden desires and souls are bound by forces they cannot escape. Here, love is dangerous, fate is relentless, and every bond comes with a price. This is Paranormal Mate Tales. Before we begin, I need your full attention because what you're about to hear is not just a tale of wolves and crowns. It's the story of a frozen omega the world tried to erase, and the Alpha King who found her just before her last heartbeat. Stay with me, because one choice in a blizzard will change an entire kingdom forever. Let the tales begin. The throne room of Dreyrune stood cold as iron and twice as unforgiving. Vargoth Ulfgard sat upon the ancient seat carved from blackened stone, his massive frame draped in furs that bore the stains of 100 winters. His crown, forged from the weapons of fallen enemies, rested heavy on his brow, a circlet of iron thorns that caught the dim torchlight like frozen stars. He was a monument to power. Broad-shouldered and towering even among alphas, Vargoth's presence alone commanded silence. Scars traced his weathered face like a map of every battle fought, every challenger broken. His eyes, pale as winter ice, held no warmth, no mercy, only the sharpened edge of a man who had learned that kindness was a luxury kingdoms could not afford. Beyond the fortress walls, Dreyrune sprawled across the frozen north like a beast chained to the earth. A wolf banners snapped in the relentless wind above snow-choked towers. The realm was built on hierarchy as unyielding as its climate. Alphas ruled with iron fists, betas served without question, and omegas existed at the margins. Tools to be used, voices to be silenced. Vargoth had not created this system, but he had perfected it. His laws were absolute. Disobedience met swift punishment. Weakness found no shelter. It was this ruthlessness, he believed, that had kept Dreyrune from crumbling during the endless wars that plagued the Western realms. Yet tonight, as he dismissed his counsel with a wave of his scarred hand, something gnawed at the edges of his certainty. The Grand Hall emptied quickly. No one lingered in the Alpha King's presence longer than necessary. Fear was his most loyal companion, obedience his only friend. Alone in his chambers, Vargoth stood at the narrow window overlooking the kingdom he had forged through blood and will. The silence pressed against him like a physical weight. No laughter echoed through these halls. No warmth softened the stone. Power, he had learned, was a solitary throne. He told himself this was strength, that mercy weakened rulers, that compassion bred chaos, but the emptiness remained. Outside, the wind began to change. What had been a steady northern gale transformed into something savage, something alive with fury. Snow swirled into violent eddies. The temperature plummeted. Vargoth's wolf instincts stirred, ancient senses honed by generations of survival. Something was wrong. The blizzard descended upon Dreyrune with the wrath of an angry god, swallowing mountains and men alike. Vargoth fastened his fur-lined cloak and stepped into the storm, his boots crunching through fresh snowfall. His guards moved to follow, but he dismissed them with a growl. He had walked through countless storms without pause, without fear. Yet tonight, something unseen pulled at his instincts like an invisible thread. A wrongness in the wind, a disturbance in the very fabric of the night. Beneath the shrieking wind, beneath the ice and fury, something called to him. And Alpha King Vargoth Ulfgard, Tyrant of the Frozen Realm, stepped deeper into the blizzard, unaware that everything he believed about power was about to shatter like ice beneath the weight of a single, dying heartbeat. Sylvana had stopped feeling the cold an hour ago. Perhaps two. Time had lost meaning beneath the weight of ice and snow that pressed against her like a burial shroud. She lay curled on her side, her frail body wrapped in torn wool that had long since surrendered to the storm's fury. Dark hair, once carefully braided, now froze in brittle strands against her hollow cheeks. Each breath came shallow and labored, a whisper of warmth in an ocean of frost. Her fingers, blue and stiff, clutched nothing but the memory of warmth. She should have been afraid, should have wept, should have cursed the gods who had abandoned her to this frozen grave. Instead, she remembered. The border pack had not been kind, but it had been survival. She saw herself as she had been just days ago, serving in the longhouse, head bowed, voice silent. Omegas learned early that invisibility was armor, that obedience bought another sunrise. But invisibility had its limits. The Alpha's hand on her wrist, the demand in his eyes, the younger Omegas watching, terrified, waiting to see if she would break. She had said no, a simple word, a death sentence. Because in Drerune, no was not an Omega's right. The system was ancient, woven into the fabric of every pack law. Alphas ruled. Betas obeyed. Omegas existed to serve. Their comfort, their consent, their very humanity negotiable at best, invisible at worst. Abuse wore the respectable mask of alpha privilege. Cruelty called itself tradition. And when victims refused to suffer in silence, the pack turned against them. Not the abuse, but the resistance to it. They had called her weak, defiant, a spreader of dangerous ideas that might infect other Omegas with the poison of self-worth. The pack elders had deliberated for less than an hour before delivering their verdict with cold efficiency. Cleansing judgment, they had called it. As if casting her into the blizzard was an act of purification rather than murder. As if letting the storm erase her was justice rather than convenience. No trial, no defense, no witness willing to speak truth to power. She had been dragged to the forest's edge at dawn, stripped of her cloak, and shoved into the wind with nothing but torn wool and the weight of their judgment. The storm had swallowed her screams. The snow had buried her footsteps. Within hours, she would be forgotten. Another Omega who simply disappeared. Another inconvenient voice silenced by winter's indifferent hand. This was how the system survived. Not through laws alone, but through the carefully cultivated belief that some lives mattered less, that some suffering was acceptable, that some deaths were inevitable. Sylvana's consciousness flickered like a dying candle. Her body had nothing left to give. The cold had claimed her extremities, was creeping toward her heart with patient inevitability. Yet even now, half buried in ice with death's fingers closing around her throat, she clung to something more stubborn than hope. Not for herself. She had accepted her fate hours ago. But for meaning. For the desperate prayer that her death would not be rendered completely meaningless. That somewhere, somehow, someone would see the injustice and refuse to look away. That the silence would finally break. Her vision blurred. White snow and gray sky merged into nothingness. Her heartbeat slowed to a whisper. Let it mean something, she thought, as darkness folded around her like frozen wings. Let someone... A massive shadow fell across her buried body, blocking out what little light remained in the storm-choked sky. Something, someone, had found her. Vargoth Ulfgard had seen death in 1,000 forms. Bodies broken on battlefields, warriors frozen mid-charge, enemies who begged and enemies who cursed. He had learned to look upon suffering with the cold indifference required of kings. But the sight before him struck something deeper than reason. She was half buried in a snowdrift, her body so small and still she might have been mistaken for discarded rags. Frost clung to her eyelashes like crystalline tears. Her lips, tinged blue, moved in silent prayer or delirium. He could not tell which. His wolf instincts recoiled. Weakness. Leave it. The storm claims what it will. Yet his body refused the command. Instead, something ancient and undeniable pulled him closer, step by reluctant step, until he stood over her broken form. He knelt. His scarred hands that had crushed throats and shattered bones, reached beneath her with unexpected gentleness. The moment his warmth touched her frozen skin, something shifted in the world. The howling wind seemed to hush, as if the storm itself held its breath. Snow fell softer, the violence in the air stilled, and then it came, a pulse. Not sound, not sight, but sensation. A thread of gold and silver light that only his wolf could see, spinning between his chest and hers. Forbidden, impossible, mate bond. Vargoth's entire body went rigid. No, this couldn't be. Mate bonds were rare, sacred things that chose equals, that bound alphas to their destined partners. Not this. Not a dying Omega found discarded in a storm like refuse. Anger flared hot in his chest. Anger at the weakness of her body, at the complication she represented, at the universe for daring to bind him to something so fragile. He should leave her. Should let the cold finish what it had started. His kingdom had no room for sentiment, no place for... Her body shifted against his chest, unconsciously seeking warmth. Her face turned toward him, and even in the grip of death, even with frost eating at her skin, there was something in her features that spoke of endurance rather than surrender. Of strength measured not in dominance, but in survival against impossible odds. His learned cruelty warred with instinct. Everything he had built his rule upon demanded he abandon her. Everything his wolf knew screamed otherwise. Damn you. He growled at the storm, at fate, at himself. Vargoth lifted her fully into his arms, his massive frame shielding her from the wind. Heat radiated from his body. Alpha fire, the furnace that kept his kind alive in the deepest winter. It flooded into her frozen flesh like liquid warmth, coaxing reluctant life back into dying limbs. The keep, he commanded the darkness. His voice carrying authority even the blizzard seemed to obey. Now. He turned toward the fortress, carrying his unexpected burden through snow and ice. Behind him, the storm resumed its fury as if disappointed by his choice. In his arms, barely conscious, Sylvana's cracked lips moved. A single word escaped, a name she should not have known, spoken in a voice that should have been silent. Vargoth. His steps faltered. She had never seen his face, never heard his voice until this moment. Yet somehow she knew. The royal healers whispered among themselves, their voices hushed with disbelief. That she had survived the blizzard at all defied explanation. That she continued to cling to life in the days that followed seemed nothing short of miraculous. Sylvana woke in fits and starts. Each returned to consciousness, bringing fresh pain. Her frostbitten fingers throbbed. Her lungs burned with every breath. Yet when a servant brought her broth, she managed a quiet thank you that made the young beta's eyes widen in surprise. Omegas did not thank servants. They barely spoke at all. Vargoth found himself drawn to the recovery chamber more often than reason justified. He stood in shadowed doorways, watching as she slowly returned to herself. She moved carefully, as if her body were made of glass. When voices rose in the corridor outside, she flinched, a reflexive recoil that spoke of old wounds deeper than frost could reach. Yet there was strength in her stillness, dignity in her silence. She did not weep or beg or perform the expected submission. She simply endured. On the third day, he entered openly. She turned her head toward him, dark eyes meeting his without cowering. "You saved my life," she said, her voice rough but steady. "I found you in my territory," he replied, the words coming harder than they should. "That is all." No. A flicker of something passed across her face. Not defiance, but clarity. "That is not all." The mate bond hummed between them, that golden thread neither could see but both could feel. That night, Vargoth dreamed of summer meadows he had never walked. Warmth that had nothing to do with fire. He woke confused and angry, his carefully constructed walls cracking. In her own chamber, Sylvana dreamed of iron crowns and frozen thrones, of a king who ruled through fear because he had forgotten any other way. She understood somehow that they were sharing more than space. Below the keep, In the archives where dust gathered on centuries of forgotten knowledge, Vyloria moved between ancient shelves. The seer's weathered hands pulled leather-bound volumes from their resting places, her eyes scanning texts that had not been read in generations. Something about the Omega troubled her. Something old. Something that whispered of bloodlines, thought lost, and balance long broken. She kept searching. Valoria climbed the tower stairs with ancient texts clutched against her chest, her face carved with urgency. She found Vargoth in the war room, alone as always. Maps of conquered territories spread before him like trophies. "You need to see this," she said without preamble. The leather-bound volume fell open on the table, revealing illuminated pages that predated Vargoth's grandfather's grandfather. Faded ink depicted Omegas not as servants, but as crowned figures standing beside Alpha rulers, their hands joined not in submission, but in balance. Veil-bound Omegas, Valoria's weathered finger traced the text. Keepers of equilibrium. They were not weak, Your Majesty. They were stabilizers, those whose empathy tempered Alpha fury, whose wisdom prevented tyranny from consuming realms whole. Vargoth's jaw tightened. Legends. History. Her eyes met his with the boldness age afforded. When the veil-bound bloodlines were hunted and scattered 3 centuries ago, accused of weakening Alpha dominance, Drerune changed. Tyrants rose where balanced rulers once stood. Cruelty became law, and the realm has bled ever since. She turned the page. There, rendered in startling detail, was a family crest Vargoth had seen only once, faintly scarred into Sylvana's shoulder blade when the healers had tended her. "She carries the blood," Valoria whispered. "Your mate is veil-bound." The words struck like thunder. Vargoth's hands gripped the table edge, knuckles white. His laws, his iron rules that permitted Alphas to do as they pleased with Omegas, had enabled Sylvana's suffering. Had nearly killed the one person fate had chosen to balance him. He had been the instrument of her destruction. Across the keep, in the garrison hall, a Torvis drained his ale and listened to whispered reports. The Omega survived. The king visited her chamber. The seer searched forbidden records. Torvis had served Vargoth through 20 campaigns, had built his reputation on ruthless efficiency and unwavering loyalty to strength. He understood power. He understood that compassion was a cancer that rotted kingdoms from within. And he understood that the frail Omega recovering in the royal chambers was the greatest threat Drerune had ever faced. Not because of what she was, but because of what she could make Vargoth become. His scarred hand found the pommel of his sword. Change could be stopped. Weaknesses could be eliminated. Kings could be saved from themselves. All it required was precision, opportunity, and the will to act. Torvis smiled into his cup and began to plan. The poison was meant to be silent. A few drops in evening tea, a quiet death attributed to lingering frost damage. Torvis had chosen his assassin carefully, a servant who owed him debts that could never be repaid. But the servant's hand had trembled. And Sylvana, who had learned in her former pack to trust nothing offered freely, had noticed the bitter scent beneath the herbs. She did not drink. When Torvis learned she still breathed, he abandoned subtlety. If the Omega would not die quietly, she would be exposed publicly, discredited before she could poison the king's mind further. The council chamber filled at dawn. Alphas in fur and iron, their faces carved with skepticism and barely concealed contempt. Sylvana stood before them, still frail from her ordeal, her simple dress a stark contrast to their martial splendor. Torvis rose first. "This Omega spreads dangerous lies, claims of abuse, of injustice. She seeks to weaken our traditions, to make Alphas subservient to—" "I seek nothing." Sylvana's voice cut through his tirade, quiet but unyielding. "Except truth." The chamber stilled. She did not rage, did not weep. She simply spoke, of Omegas beaten for refusing violation, of children torn from mothers deemed unworthy, of deaths disguised as accidents when inconvenient voices grew too loud. She named no names, assigned no blame, simply laid bare the architecture of suffering that had operated unchallenged for generations. "I am not here to accuse you," she said, meeting each council member's eyes in turn. "I am here to ask, is this the strength you wish to build? Or have we mistaken cruelty for power so long we have forgotten the difference?" Valoria stepped forward, her arms laden with ancient texts. The veil-bound Omegas once stood as proof that strength and compassion need not be enemies, that balance makes kingdoms endure where tyranny makes them burn. The council erupted. Some shouted for her removal. Others fell silent, old certainties cracking. Then Vargoth rose from his throne. "Enough." His voice carried the weight of absolute authority. "She speaks with my protection. Any who move against her move against their king." The chamber froze. The tyrant had chosen his side. And Dreyroon would never be the same. The old law was clear. When an alpha questioned his king's judgment, blood could answer what words could not. Torvis invoked it before the sun had fully risen, his voice ringing across the frozen courtyard where the entire garrison had assembled. "You have forsaken strength for sentiment. You dishonor every warrior who bled for Dreyroon's dominance." Vargoth descended the keep steps, his fur cloak billowing behind him. "Then let strength decide." They met in the center of the courtyard, boots crunching through fresh snow. No weapons. The old law demanded claws and fang, alpha against alpha, primal and absolute. The duel was brutality refined. Torvis fought with the fury of a man defending his entire worldview. Every strike aimed to kill. Vargoth met him with the accumulated violence of 2 decades of war. They crashed together like avalanches, tore at each other with savage efficiency, painted the white snow red. The realm watched. Sylvana watched, hands pressed against the tower window, her heart a drum of fear. Vargoth was stronger, had always been stronger. Within minutes, Torvis lay broken in the snow, throat exposed, waiting for the killing blow that tradition demanded. Vargoth's claws hovered at his commander's jugular. One swipe, one moment. Everything he had been taught about power demanded he finish this. Instead, he stepped back. "No." The word carried across the silent courtyard. "You live, but you leave." Torvis's eyes widened in shock, then burned with humiliation. "You would show me mercy? You would prove me right that you've grown weak?" "I prove," Vargoth's voice rang like iron on stone, "that strength is choosing restraint when destruction would be easier. That power is deciding who lives, not merely who dies." He turned to face the assembled crowd. Warriors, servants, nobles, all watching their king redefine the very foundation of his rule. The reign of fear ends today. Dreyroon will be strong not through cruelty, but through justice. And not through dominance, but through balance. Any who cannot accept this may follow Torvis into exile. None moved. In the tower window, Sylvana exhaled a breath she hadn't known she was holding. History had just changed its course. They brought the border pack leaders to Dreyroon in chains, expecting execution. The Alpha who had ordered her death, the elders who had called it justice, the enforcers who had dragged her into the storm, all stood before the throne, awaiting the vengeance they knew they deserved. Sylvana faced them without guards, without weapons, just herself and the truth they had tried to bury in the ice. "You cast me out to die," she said, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. "You called it cleansing, called it necessary. You believed my refusal to submit made me dangerous." The former Alpha's jaw tightened. "You defied the natural order. Omegas who forget their place spread poison." "No." Sylvana's interruption was quiet but absolute. "I remembered my humanity. That was my crime. That is what you could not tolerate." She turned to Vargoth, standing silent beside the throne. "I could demand their deaths. Old law would permit it. They tried to murder me under the guise of tradition." The chamber held its breath. "But I will not become what they are." She faced her tormentors again. "You will live, and you will change. Confusion rippled through the prisoners. Every pack under Drayrune's banner will establish Omega protections, Sylvana declared, her voice gaining strength. Sanctuaries where any who suffer abuse can find refuge. Education systems teaching that strength does not require subjugation. Reform councils with Omega representation to ensure laws serve justice, not cruelty. She stepped closer to the former Alpha, meeting his eyes without flinching. You will oversee these changes in your territory. You will ensure no Omega suffers what I suffered. And you will report your progress to this throne every season. Failure means permanent exile. You would trust us too. I would give you the chance I was never offered. The chance to learn, to become better than you were. Her voice softened. Mercy is not weakness. It is the hardest kind of strength. The prisoners were led away, not to dungeons, but to chambers where Valoria would begin their education in Drayrune's new order. Word spread through the realm like wildfire. The Omega who had survived the blizzard had chosen reform over revenge, justice over retribution. And slowly, carefully, the people began to believe that change was possible. The coronation took place as the first thaw touched Drayrune's peaks. Not a traditional ceremony of bloodline and conquest, but something the realm had never witnessed. A crowning by choice. Sylvana stood before the assembled kingdom, no longer the frail Omega pulled from the ice, but a woman forged by survival into something unbreakable. The crown they offered was lighter than Vargoth's iron thorns, woven from silver and winter roses, symbols of resilience, not domination. I accept this crown, she said, her voice carrying across the great hall. Not as a prize, but as a promise. That no Omega in Drayrune will ever again be cast into the cold. That strength will be measured not by who we break, but by who we protect. The hall erupted in acknowledgement. Not the fearful obedience of before, but something genuine, something earned. That night, in the privacy of their chambers, Vargoth did something no one in Drayrune would have believed possible. The Tyrant King knelt before his queen, his scarred hands finding hers. You saved me, he said simply. Not from the storm. From myself. Sylvana's fingers traced the line of his jaw. We saved each other. The mate bond between them blazed warm and golden, no longer forbidden, no longer fought. Accepted, celebrated, complete. In the months that followed, Drayrune transformed. The new laws spread across the realm like spring breaking winter's grip. Alphas attended councils on restraint and responsibility. Omegas found refuge in sanctuaries where their voices mattered, their safety guaranteed. Education replaced tradition, compassion tempered strength. The border pacts that had once cast Sylvana out sent emissaries seeking forgiveness. She granted reform instead, demanding they prove change through action, not words. Winter still came to Drayrune each year, fierce and unforgiving. But within the keeps, within the halls where new laws were written and old wounds slowly healed, warmth endured. Vargoth Ulfgard became a legend not for the kingdoms he conquered, but for the kingdom he chose to change. And the frozen Omega he found dying in a blizzard became the warmth that saved a realm. Thank you for listening to this story all the way to the end. If Sylvana's strength, Vargoth's transformation, and the power of mercy over cruelty moved you even a little, don't let the journey end here. Like, subscribe, and share this story with someone who believes that love can rewrite fate. Until our next forbidden tale, may the moon guide you, and may your heart stay warm.